Hello, everyone. This is the chapter 4 overview. So let's go ahead and get started. All right. So this chapter focuses on social class, on wealth, and how social class and wealth are used in the United States to generate income, to generate power, privilege, opportunities, and great influence over how the society operates. So we're going to first start with social class. You've all heard it, I'm sure, the term social class, and you all have an idea of what that means. When sociologists, political scientists, academics talk about social class, they're referring to different groups of people who have a similar situation. They live a similar lifestyle, have similar levels of education, similar educations, occupations, etc. And so you can find that there are different classifications, different textbooks, different political scientists, different sociologists use different classifications. But for our purposes, we're going to rely on the 5 that are identified in the text. So let's take a look at those 5, and let's see as we go along if you can identify which class you are in. So the first one of the 5 is the privileged category, or sorry, the upper class or the super class. These are people who have so much income, typically about $350,000 or so, or more, of course, in a year. And the important thing here to remember is that this income is primarily coming from investments and inheritance. There may be some people who have top corporate positions paying them millions of dollars in compensation, but they also are making lots of money from investments and possibly an inheritance. This group is just under 2% of the population. Okay. A really good example, one's been in the news quite a lot lately, is Elon Musk. He's in this super class of people who have probably more money than they can spend, although of course, he's trying to buy Twitter, so maybe that'll take all his money. And then, of course, the second privileged group is the upper middle class. And these are people who also are fairly well educated. Many of them perhaps went to Ivy League institutions or other top-notch or prestigious institutions. Many of them, of course, may have postgraduate degrees, doctorates, or MBA, things after a bachelor's degree. Of course, these are people who typically are doing professional work, so doctors, lawyers, engineers, architects, people like that, as well as high-level management positions. They may own small or medium-sized businesses, and their yearly income is upwards of $100K to about $350K. They're just under 30% of the population. Then the 2 largest groups are the middle class, and the working class. Now, sometimes this group, the middle class, is also known as the lower middle class. Just depends on the academic who is constructing the hierarchy. But it's important to consider that regardless of whether you say middle class or lower middle class, you're talking about a group of people who typically have an income between 50 and 100K a year. They're about 32% of the population. These are people who have some college, typically, maybe an AA or maybe even a bachelor's degree. They might be engaged in lower management. They're semi-professional, people who perhaps are physician's assistants or, physical therapists, etc. They generally have completed high school. The second group, that is, again, the 2 larger, the 32% and the 17%, the second group is the working class. And these are people who typically have a high school diploma, maybe a certificate, maybe a little bit of college, maybe an AA or certificate from a community college perhaps, but these are typically people who are making around 30 to 50K a year, Lots of people in this category are clerical workers. They work retail. They may be servers at restaurants because, you know, tips can push them into that 30K or more. They are people who might have, you know, they might be people who have their own small businesses. Maybe they are contractors or handymen or painters. You know, they own maybe a small business such as that. And these are people that they're about 17% of the population. And then there are two lower classes, and one is the working poor and the other is the underclass. The working poor people who have incomes of less than $30,000 a year, they're just under 20% of the population. These are people who engage in doing service work, right? They're cleaning office buildings, they're cleaning hotel rooms, they are working construction, they may be engaged in some lower level clerical work, maybe a receptionist versus somebody who's, say, a paralegal, you know, who would be in the middle class. And they often don't have a high school diploma or certificate, although they may, but it's typically that they don't have one. And then the underclass, these are people whose income is about $15,000 a year or less. Yep, there are people who live in the United States on $15,000 a year or less. If you think about that, that's not a whole lot more, over $1,000 a year. These are people who are either working on their unemployed, or they are working part-time, or they might be what is called underemployed, meaning that they could do some work that would enable them to make more money, but they don't have one of those jobs. They haven't been able to find one of those jobs. These are often people who are receiving public assistance or, you know, some other state subsidy, and they may be living homeless, or living in their cars, or living with relatives, sleeping on the extra couch, etc. So as we went through, I hope you were able to identify where you are in this group. One of the things that is discussed in the text, and I have found this to be quite true as well, is that people all, regardless of where they really are in that hierarchy, they all seem to identify as middle class. And this is even true of politicians. A lot of politicians, even though they're quite wealthy, think of themselves as middle class, or at least that's what they say when they're talking to their constituents. And almost all politicians, when you hear them giving a speech, they talk about the middle class. They're concerned with the middle class. You rarely hear them talk about the poor or the working class. They almost always are focused on the middle class and what they can do for the middle class. Something else that is quite common is that the media also tends to focus on middle class consumerism, on the things that, quote, you know, the larger group can buy. TV shows, newspapers, billboards, magazines, you know, they all are focused on here's what the masses can buy, and don't really focus much on what the people in the super class are buying. You know, we're not really seeing ads or billboards for $500,000 yachts, nor are we typically seeing ads for, I don't know, something that the working class would buy. I don't know, really. But you use your imagination. I'm going to go here. Income and wealth. Now, when we're talking about social class, we do include income and wealth. Now, a lot of people use these interchangeably, but they are not interchangeable. They are actually two different things. Income are wages, right? People go out to a job, they get a paycheck, though that's income. It's wages or a salary, profits from your business, stock, dividends, maybe you own property, you get rent, money actually coming in, okay, on a weekly or monthly or yearly basis, money coming in, that's income. Wealth is inclusive of everything that is an economic asset that is worth money and could be converted into cash. So, of course, our cars and our real property, stocks, bonds, real estate, a business, all of those things are economic assets that could be converted into cash. And of course, affluent families have more income and more wealth than people in those lower 2 or 3 rungs. In fact, there's a clip that I put into the module for this week that you should take a look at to see how it plays out when you're trying to divide pumpkin pie up into, how much does the upper class have, the middle upper class, the lower class, etc. And it's quite interesting to see how people in a mall, as they're walking by and they're asked to participate in the exercise, how they split it up and how very wrong they are. As I said, lifestyle is part of social class, how we live, what kind of car we drive, what kind of home we live in, what kind of community, what kind of educational opportunities are available to us. All of those things are part of social class, which is part of one's lifestyle. Now, we know in the US, we get sold this, what I call myth of social mobility, how all you have to do is work hard in the United States, work hard, network, go to school, do all the things you're supposed to do, and you will achieve social mobility, you will achieve great success, great material success. Well, the reality is that, especially if you watch that clip, you will see that's not so true. That's not as true as many people believe it to be. But this gives legitimation to that ideology, to that way of thinking that if you do these things, then you will be materially successful. Of course, the opposite end of that spectrum is what people believe as well, that if you don't do all the things you're supposed to do, then it's because you just didn't work hard enough, or you didn't try hard enough, or you didn't go to school, it's all your fault if you're not materially successful, which is not necessarily the case. That American ideology is based on things such as, individual achievement, right? Pulling yourself up by your bootstrap, using your own talent, your skills, your abilities, your efforts, your hard work, everything that you have in your toolbox as an individual that you can use. The hard work as well, that idea that you just got to work hard, right? That's all you got to do. Also, people tend to believe that there's this equality of opportunity in the United States that doesn't necessarily exist. We know that there is a lot of prejudice that people have against individuals depending upon things such as race or gender, sexual identity, gender identity, height, weight, skin color. Yes, there's such a thing as colorism. And so religion even sometimes. And so even just how we dress can cause someone to think either very highly of us or negatively of us. So that equality of opportunity does not necessarily exist. In a perfect world it would, but we're humans and we make judgments about people based on how they look, who they are. Also, there's a lot of support for this idea that capitalism is the greatest thing in the world and that it doesn't really need any tweaking. It works, and all you've got to do is work within the confines of this capitalist system, and you will be productive. And of course, people who have been able to do this are held up as examples of, look, if this person did it, then you should be able to do it too. If Barack Obama could become president as a black man, then you should be able to do it too. Or you should, be able to achieve success in politics too. Or if Oprah Winfrey as a black woman could be successful and start her own production company, then if you work hard and that's your goal, you should be able to do it too. The reality is this: those individuals are just that. They are individuals. They have particular talents, skills, and abilities that not necessarily every black person has. No racial or ethnic group, no religious group, etc. No group is monolithic. We're not all the same just because we're in the same group. And it's important to understand that and recognize it. when we think about social mobility, we usually are focused on upward social mobility, right? On how we can maybe start from the lower middle class and move up to the upper middle class, or to come from the working class and maybe move up to the middle class. The reality is that it is possible. However, it's not as easy as people seem to think that it might be, that all you've got to do is work hard and do the right things, etc. There are several myths that we tend to believe. One, of course, is that if you just have initiative, right? If you just show the initiative, if you show how motivated and dedicated, committed you are, that'll get you the interview, it'll get you the job. And that's not necessarily always true. I'm sure that you have all heard the cliche, it's not what you know, but who you know. If you consider people in President Biden's administration or former President Trump's administration or any presidential administration before then, consider that someone doesn't get to be the chief of staff or the head of the Department of Justice or the head of the Department of Homeland Security, etc. People don't get those kinds of jobs because they put their resumes on Indeed or LinkedIn or Monster.com or any of those other resources out there for people to post their resumes and get noticed. That's not how those people get those jobs. It's who they know that helps them get those jobs. So it's not really true that initiative is going to do it. Neither is the idea that hard work pays off. A lot of people work hard every single day. They get up, they go to work, they put in 8 or 9 hours, they go home, they feed their families, they bathe their families, they put their families to bed, they get up the next day and they do it again and they pay their bills, etc. They work hard, and yet they are not wealthy. Hard work is not the only way to, or it is not a guarantee that you are going to reach high levels of material success. And this idea to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, all you have to do is woman up or man up or person up and, just get yourself out there and just get going. Well, if you're somebody with a mental health issue, particularly one that is undiagnosed, it's not necessarily your fault that you can't focus at a job. Perhaps because you have ADHD or you have anxiety or something else. We have to remember that not everybody is the same. And just because one person is able to do it is not necessarily true that another person can do it, because they may not have the same set of tools in their toolbox as the person who did make it. Intergenerational mobility is just simply looking at where a parent starts, what social class they're in, and then what happens with their children. And in 100, 150 years ago, it was probably fairly likely that children would be able to move from one generation up into the next, or at least it was easier. And I think about my own parents as immigrants to the United States in the 1940s. During World War II, they were braceros, they were farm workers, and that is how they met. They met as in the fields, working, picking fruits and veggies when they came here from Mexico. They met, they got married, they had 9 kids. Eventually, they were able to buy a house, and eventually they were able to buy a small business, and they did okay for themselves, which meant that I was able then to do okay as well. In fact, I would say I did probably better than okay. I was able to go to Stanford. I was able to earn 2 degrees from Stanford and then subsequently go to law school. Now, my parents did not help me to do that because they did not believe that education was important. They were of the mind that all you had to do was work hard and show up and do everything possible and you could get material wealth. Education in their minds wasn't important because they'd been able to do it without education. So the reality, though, is in the last 20 years, this idea of upward mobility, most people still believe they can achieve it. But if you look at what's actually happening, that actually has not happened. And so one thing we have seen happen, though, is what's called structural mobility, where technology, perhaps, or the change within an institution creates an increase or decrease in certain jobs. So think about how technology has really created the need for software engineers, for people who are coders, etc. That's a very specific type of job that didn't exist 35, 40, 50 years ago and more. And so now there is this need for people who know how to do that. There's less of a need, though, for manufacturing, which means then that all those good, those well-paying factory jobs that were union jobs that people had in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s and even in through the 70s began to decline in the 1980s, partly because of technology. But what really sped it up was technology. But the other piece of why it started to happen in the 80s is because so many car manufacturers began to manufacture their cars in Mexico or in other countries and then ship them back. And then, of course, more foreign cars were coming into the United States, which meant that the demand for American cars decreased. And if you aren't making as many cars, you don't need as many people on the factory line. People who are in the super class, and maybe even the upper middle class, I wouldn't say middle class, but the upper middle class, are typically engaged in either being on the board of these particular things or working at these particular places. So that's really, say, super class and upper middle class. That's a typo there. So foundations. These are organizations that are founded by people in the super class. And these foundations spend a lot of money on research and education, the arts, etc. One of the foundations I'm sure that you are aware of is the one that Bill Gates founded. Now, his wife, once they got divorced, she got a lot of money. She started her own foundation and is really focused on women and education and healthcare. There are a lot of other foundations out there that wealthy people fund. That's how some of them use their money. Think tanks. Think tanks are these organizations, again, typically nonprofit organizations that are focused on a particular policy, set of policy analysis or research. And one very well-known one, it's on the conservative side, it is a think tank. It's called the Hoover Institution, and it is based at Stanford University. It is a conservative think tank. They focus on policy making and research from a conservative perspective. You can, of course, find the Brennan Center, which is another think tank that's an organization that is more progressive in the research and the policy making process that they engage in. So they're on both ends of the spectrum and some in the middle too. Universities, some of the largest, most prestigious universities, they're listed there for you to see. They not only provide education for people who eventually will go on to lead large corporations or be political leaders, but they also help to either house some of these foundations or think tanks, like in the case of the Hoover Center at Stanford University, but they also help to create these different policy-making groups that later on have great influence. And then lobbying. I just want to finish up quickly with lobbying. Lobbying is big business in the United States. Lobbying is a situation in which individuals who are hired by groups go out and try to influence government officials to support legislation or policies that are sought by their clients. So I want you to consider the National Rifle Association. Now that's a 501c3 organization. It's a nonprofit organization. However, even a nonprofit organization like the NRA can have a lobbying arm which is funded by donations from people who know that their money cannot be deducted because it is going to be used for lobbying. The same thing is true of other nonprofit organizations. 501c3 is what the tax code is for these organizations. The Sierra Club, the ASPCA, the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. So are any number of organizations that may be nonprofit organizations, but they can have an arm, a separate arm, that is funded by donations of individuals or groups or corporations who donate to that lobbying arm, knowing that the money is going to be used to go out and try to influence government officials, government politicians, to try to create policy that is consistent with how that group would like to see new legislation made, or revamp or revise existing legislation. And of course, campaign contributions are what people may use to not only bring name recognition to the candidate, but also to embellish their own personal image. And sometimes that might backfire. You might have recently heard about the Florida law, the quote, was being called the Don't Say Gay law. And apparently Disney Corporation gave lots of money to some of the legislators who helped to create the bill and ultimately voted in favor of it. Well, that was not good for Disney, because many of its employees, not just at Disney World or Disneyland, but working at the studios, on cruises, etc., a lot of them protested and walked out for several days because they said it doesn't feel good to work for a corporation that gives campaign contributions to people who create legislation like the Don't Say Gay bill. Of course, Disney's CEO came out and said, well, when we give campaign contributions to politicians, we can't necessarily know how they're going to vote on legislation, or how they're going to develop legislation, which I think is BS, because I have given, not big ones, but small campaign contributions of $50 or $100 to people running for office, and I give that contribution with the understanding that I'm supporting this person because I believe in the kinds of things that they say they believe in and hopefully will do in office. So I think that was very disingenuous of the CEO of Disney to claim, well, we didn't know how they were going to vote or how they felt on these issues. What's really interesting, and this is where I want to finish up, what's really interesting about the United States when you compare it to other democracies that are comparable to the U.S., most of Europe, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. When you look at those democracies, they use a political system that is based on what we call proportional representation. Proportional representation means that the government, whether it's at the national level or the state level, is created by matching the votes that a party receives with the number of seats that it receives in the government, or as I said, at the federal level or at the state level. So the idea is this: if in, say, New Zealand or Canada, there are 5 different parties, say, and it is common in those other countries where you have multiple parties that actually are influential, or even in Britain, say, or again, different parts of Europe. If there's the Peace and Freedom Party that only gets 10% of the vote, well, then they get 10 seats at the table. If the Democratic Party gets 35 votes, then they get 35 seats at the table. If the Republicans get 40 votes, then they get, or 40% of the votes, then they get 40 seats at the table. And if the other 20% is split between the Socialist Democratic Party, they get 10 seats because it's 10%, and then the last 10% goes to the the Bernie Sanders party, then that party would get 10 seats. And so you have a representation that is broader than the representation we have in the U.S. In the U.S., we really have only 2 functioning, and functioning I'll use the term loosely, functioning political parties, because we have this winner-take-all system. And really only two political parties have been viable for over the last 100 years or so. There was a time in the United States when there were smaller political parties that had some influence, but by the 20th century, it really was just the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And so maybe that's something that, we should address at some point in the United States. I don't see that happening anytime soon, though. That's the end of chapter 4. Thank you.